Walked into the garage looking for the lawn edger, and that's when I saw the box. It was sitting on the second shelf, right next to the old paint cans I kept telling myself I'd throw out. A shoebox wrapped in duct tape with my name written on the top in her handwriting. Arthur. Just that, nothing else. My wife's name was Helen. She passed 22 months ago, February, in the middle of a snowstorm that knocked out the power for 3 days. Pancreatic cancer. Fast and mean, like everything she wasn't in life. We'd been married 38 years. I didn't know what to do with myself after she was gone. I still don't, most mornings. I stood there holding the box for a long time before I brought it inside. The shoebox sat on the kitchen table for 2 days before I opened it. I'm not sure why I waited. I think part of me knew that whatever was in there was going to change something, and I wasn't ready to have anything else change. I'd already had enough change to last 10 lifetimes. I'd sold her car. I'd donated her clothes to St. Michael's thrift store on Maple. I'd taken her reading glasses off the nightstand where she always left them and put them in a drawer because I couldn't look at them anymore and couldn't throw them away either. On the 3rd morning, I made my coffee, sat down at the table, and pulled off the tape. Inside there was a USB drive and a small Ziploc bag, a handwritten note folded into thirds, and a photograph of the 2 of us at Yellowstone. 1994. I remember that trip. Helen wore that yellow windbreaker the whole time, even when it wasn't cold. I read the note first. Arthur, if you're reading this, then I wasn't able to tell you in person. I need you to watch what's on this drive before you talk to Nathan. I need you to watch it alone. Do not tell him you found this. I know this is a lot to ask, but please trust me one more time. I've always been on your side. That's never going to change, even now. Hate Nathan as our son. He's 41. He works in commercial real estate up in Minneapolis, or at least that's what he's told me for the better part of a decade. I had no reason to doubt him. He drives a nice truck. He takes vacations. He sends me photos of my 2 grandkids, Lily and Ben, every few weeks, and that's been mostly the extent of our communication since Helen died. It was different when she was alive. She was the one who called him every Sunday without fail, the one who remembered his birthday and his wife Cassandra's birthday and the kids' school events. I worked. I retired. I became someone who sat in a house that was too big and too quiet, and Helen held everything together with both hands until she couldn't anymore. After she was gone, Nathan called me maybe once a month. He drove down to Duluth twice in those first 6 months. Both times he brought paperwork. The first time it was a financial power of attorney. He sat at that same kitchen table and explained, very reasonably, that since I was now alone, it would be a good idea for him to be authorized to handle certain financial matters in case something happened to me. He was calm. He used phrases like just a precaution and peace of mind. I was still in the fog of grief. I signed it. The second time he brought a proposal to refinance the house and consolidate my retirement accounts into an investment vehicle he said his firm used. He had a binder. He had charts. He said the return projections were strong and that my existing accounts were underperforming. I told him I needed to think about it. He didn't like that. He kept circling back to it for weeks by phone, mentioning the opportunity costs, the market timing, words designed to make me feel like I was being foolish by hesitating. I held off, but I didn't know why I was holding off. I just felt something at the base of my chest, the way you do when something isn't adding up, but you can't name what it is. I didn't know then that Helen had already named it for me. I don't own a laptop anymore. Mine died last spring and I hadn't bothered replacing it. I drove to the library on 7th Street and used one of the public computers in the back corner. I brought my own headphones. I plugged in the drive and sat there looking at the single file on it for almost 5 minutes before I clicked. Helen was sitting at our kitchen table, same table I eat at every morning. She was wearing her green cardigan, the one with the loose button on the second-to-last hole. Her hair was shorter than I remembered it in her last months, so this had to be earlier. She looked tired, but her eyes were clear, and she looked directly into the camera with an expression I recognized immediately, the one she used when she was about to say something she'd been sitting on for a long time. She said, "Hi, sweetheart." I had to stop the video. I sat in that library corner for several minutes just staring at the paused image of my wife's face. An older woman at the next computer over glanced at me and looked away without a word, which I was grateful for. I put my headphones back on and started from the beginning. She'd recorded it herself. Propped the laptop up on the sugar canister I keep by the stove. She spoke for about 40 minutes. I'm going to try to tell you what she said as clearly as I can. But I want to warn you, there were parts of it I've had to go back and watch again because the first time through I wasn't taking in the words. I was just watching her move, watching her be alive again. She started by saying she hoped she'd been able to tell me some of this in person before she ran out of time. She said she had tried to find the right moment, but each time she brought herself to it, she would look at me and think about how much I was already carrying, and she would put it off one more day. She apologized for that. She said she knew it was her fear, not my weakness, and she was sorry for not giving me the chance. Then she told me about Nathan. It started, she said, about 2 years before her diagnosis. Nathan had come to her. Not to me, to her specifically, which she said should have been her first signal, and asked if she and I would be willing to co-sign a business loan. He'd found a commercial property deal in a suburb of Minneapolis that he said had significant upside. He said his own credit was temporarily extended due to some restructuring in his current portfolio. He needed $180,000 backed by a co-signature, and he needed it before the deal window closed. Helen said she told him she'd think about it and talk to me. She never told me. Instead, she said, she started making some calls. She had a college friend named Paula who worked in banking for 30 years. She asked Paula, as a favor, to look into Nathan's financial situation using whatever professional means she had access to. Helen was always resourceful in ways that I never fully appreciated until I was watching her describe this from beyond the grave. What Paula found was not good. Nathan had 3 personal loans and 2 business credit lines that were behind or in restructuring. He had a tax lien filed against a property holding company he'd formed in 2019. His wife Cassandra had filed for separation in 2021, not divorce, separation, and the proceedings had been quietly suspended, which Paula said sometimes indicated a financial dispute being handled behind closed doors rather than in court. None of this had ever been mentioned to me. Not once. Helen confronted Nathan herself. She met him for lunch in Minneapolis in the fall of that year. She said she looked him in the eye and told him she knew about the loans, the lien, and Cassandra. She said he didn't flinch, which scared her more than if he had. He told her the problems were being resolved. He told her not to worry. He told her, "Mom, you know I've always taken care of things." Then he asked again about the co-signature. She told him no. He called her twice more that month. He started suggesting gently that it might be time for me to think about next steps with the house. Something smaller, easier to manage. He started dropping in questions about my health, my driving, whether I was keeping up with the yard. Helen said she recognized these as the first moves of a much longer play. She'd seen it happen to her own aunt, whose son had spent 15 years methodically establishing his mother's incompetence before getting conservatorship over her estate. She said she thought about telling me then, and she still didn't, and she said the decision to record this video was her making peace with herself for all the time she didn't. She said she loved me. She said I was the best person she'd ever been close to, and that she needed me to not be foolish on her behalf. Then she told me where she'd put everything. The second file on the drive was a folder. Inside were copies of the documents Paula had pulled, including the lien filing and a summary of the loan defaults. There was a printed email chain between Helen and a trust and estate attorney named Sheila Crane, dated 13 months before Helen died, outlining revisions to our will that Helen had apparently requested and had notarized at a time when Nathan was supposedly driving down to help me repaint the fence on the south side of the house. There was also a screenshot. It was a text conversation between Nathan and someone saved in his phone as C. Helen had gotten it from Cassandra, who had reached out to Helen herself at some point in the separation. I don't know all the details of how it changed hands. The text exchange was dated the same week Nathan first brought me the power of attorney paperwork. In the exchange, Nathan told C that I was barely tracking, and that if they could get the accounts moved before spring, the rest would fall into place. I sat in that library for 3 hours. When I finally drove home, I sat in the driveway for a while before I went inside. It was a Tuesday in early October, and the oak tree in the front yard was at peak color. That particular orange-red that only lasts about 4 days before it goes brown and falls. Helen used to make me stop and look at it. She'd come out on the porch with her coffee and just watch the leaves like she was storing it up. I thought about that, and then I went inside and called Sheila Crane. Sheila had been Helen's attorney, not mine, but she took my call within the hour. She said she'd been hoping to hear from me. She said that Helen had been very thorough, and that there were some things we needed to go over at my earliest convenience. We met in her office the following Thursday. What Helen had done, working quietly over the final year of her life, was substantial. She had revised our estate plan so that my retirement accounts, my pension from 31 years at the shipyard, my IRA, our joint investment accounts, were held in a trust that Nathan did not control and could not access. She had named a professional trustee, a firm Sheila worked with regularly, to administer any distributions after my death. Nathan would receive an inheritance, a fair one, but he would not receive it in a lump sum, and he would not have discretionary authority over any of it during my lifetime. She had also, based on Sheila's advice, filed a revocation of the financial power of attorney that I had signed at Nathan's request. I hadn't known this was possible, that a revocation could be pre-arranged to take effect upon certain conditions. Sheila explained the legal specifics in more detail than I can reproduce accurately here, but the short version is that my signature had been legally limited in ways I hadn't understood when I gave it. Helen had understood. The revocation had been filed. My signature gave Nathan very little of what he thought it gave him. I asked Sheila how Helen had found her. She smiled and said Helen had shown up at her office unannounced on a Wednesday afternoon, sat down in the waiting area, and told the receptionist she'd wait as long as it took to see someone. She'd waited 2 hours. Sheila said she still had the notepad Helen had brought with her. She said she'd never had a client walk in as prepared as Helen was that day. That sounded exactly right to me. I didn't call Nathan for 2 weeks. I used the time to do my own looking. I called my financial advisor, a man named George, who I'd been with for 12 years, and asked him to send me a full current accounting of my accounts. He seemed surprised I was asking. Apparently Nathan had been calling him as well, inquiring about my balances and asking about the process for consolidating accounts under a power of attorney. George had told him he'd need documentation and my direct authorization, and Nathan had told him that was being arranged. I asked George to note in my file that I had contacted him directly and that no third-party access was to be granted without a phone call from me personally. He agreed without any hesitation. I also called my neighbor Barbara across the street. Barbara is 73, sharper than people give her credit for, and she has lived across from me for 16 years. I asked her, without fully explaining why, if she'd noticed Nathan coming by the house lately. She paused. She said yes, actually, twice in September, both times when my truck wasn't in the driveway. She'd assumed I'd gone to the store and thought nothing of it at the time. I thought something of it. Nathan called me on a Thursday afternoon in late October, which he would have no way of knowing was 2 days after I'd had a second meeting with Sheila. His voice was easy, the way it always was. He asked how I was doing. He asked if I'd had the furnace checked before winter. He mentioned the grandkids' Halloween costumes. Then, after several minutes, he brought up the investment account consolidation again. He said some of the window on the opportunity was closing and that he wanted to get me on a call with his associate before the end of the month. I let him finish. Then I told him I'd been in touch with Sheila Crane. There was a silence that lasted long enough that I looked at my phone to make sure the call was still connected. He said he wasn't familiar with that name. I told him he didn't need to be. I told him I knew about the lien, I knew about the loans, I knew about the text to see about getting the accounts moved before spring. I said I knew about his conversation with George. I told him I'd spoken with Cassandra myself, briefly, the week before, and that she'd been forthcoming. I kept my voice level. I wasn't angry exactly, or rather, the anger was there, but it was underneath something else, something quieter and more resolved. Helen had handed me this calmness from wherever she was. I believe that, and I still do. Nathan started explaining. He said the texts had been taken out of context. He said his financial issues were old and resolved. He said Cassandra had her own grievances that distorted her perspective. He started to raise his voice slightly, not quite shouting, but moving in that direction, and then he caught himself and recalibrated into something more measured and reasonable sounding, and that recalibration, that practiced, smooth resettling, told me more than anything else had. I said, Nathan, I'm not asking for explanations. I'm telling you what I know. He was quiet again. I told him the power of attorney was no longer valid. I told him my accounts were in a trust and that Sheila was my point of contact for any estate questions going forward. I told him the house was in my name, would remain in my name, and that I had no plans to sell or refinance it. Then I said, You're going to inherit something when I'm gone. That hasn't changed. Your mother wanted that, and I'm honoring it. But I need you to understand that I'm 68 years old. I am not confused. I am not incompetent. And I am not incompetent, and I am not available to be managed. I don't know if I expected him to say he was sorry. Part of me did, I think. That part of me still wanted a version of Nathan that doesn't seem to exist. A son who got caught and was ashamed of himself. What he said was, I was just trying to help, Dad. I said, I know that's what you were doing. And I ended the call. The months after that were strange in their quietness. Nathan stopped calling. He sent a text on Thanksgiving, brief, appropriate. He sent a Christmas card with a photo of Lily and Ben in matching sweaters, and I put it on the refrigerator because the kids had nothing to do with any of it. I had dinner with Barbara twice and told her most of what had happened. She was not entirely surprised. She said she'd always thought Nathan had a businessman's eyes, and that she'd never seen him come by the house without an agenda. I laughed at that. It felt good to laugh. I started seeing a grief counselor in November, which I'd been resistant to for almost 2 years. Her name is Dr. Portman, and she's in her late 50s and has a manner that reminds me of Helen in the way she doesn't let me get away with vague answers. She asked me once what it felt like to watch the video, and I said I didn't know how to describe it. She waited. I said it felt like Helen had kept a promise I never knew she'd made. I still watch it sometimes. Not often, but when I need to hear her voice or see that expression on her face before she says something she's been carrying for a long time. I plug in the drive and I sit down and I let her talk. The house is still too quiet. That hasn't changed. The oak tree out front did that orange-red thing again this October, and I went out on the porch with my coffee and watched it the way she used to, and I stayed out there long enough that the coffee got cold. I didn't mind. I wasn't alone. I've thought a lot about what made Nathan believe he could do what he did. He's not a stupid man. He's not cruel in the obvious ways. He never raised his voice at me, never said anything openly disrespectful. What he did was quieter than that, and in some ways that's what's hardest to sit with. He looked at his father and calculated. He weighed what I was worth against what I might do about it, and he decided the math worked in his favor. He was wrong, but not because the universe corrected him. He was wrong because Helen didn't let him be right. That's the thing I keep coming back to. I didn't outsmart my son. I didn't catch him through my own vigilance or some sharp instinct I'd developed over 68 years. I was tired and grieving and more than a little lost, and I signed a document I shouldn't have signed because I trusted someone I'd raised. Helen is the one who saw what was coming. Helen is the one who sat down at the kitchen table with a laptop and recorded 40 minutes of herself while she was sick, while she was running out of time, because she chose to use what she had left to protect me rather than spare herself the discomfort of saying hard things out loud. That takes something. A particular kind of honesty that most people spend their whole lives avoiding. It's easier to let difficult things go unsaid. It's easier to tell yourself the problem might resolve on its own, or that bringing it up will only make things worse. Helen chose the harder thing, and she chose it for my benefit, not hers. I don't think I'll ever stop being humbled by that, what I've learned. And I don't say this lightly, because I'm not naturally given to drawing lessons from pain, is that the people who love you clearly are sometimes the only protection you have against the people who love you conditionally. Helen knew our son in a way I didn't want to know him. She watched him with her eyes open, when I was still watching him with a father's hope. That's not a failure on my part. But it meant that when the moment came, I needed what she'd prepared. I think about the version of this story where I never found that shoebox, where I went on assuming Nathan's concern was genuine, where I signed the consolidation paperwork before spring and watched accounts I'd built over 30 years shift out from under me while I was too deep in grief to track what was happening. That version existed. It was entirely possible. The only thing that stood between me and that version was a woman who refused to leave without making sure I had what I needed. The hardest part of being a man who believes he can take care of himself is accepting that you needed taking care of. I'm still working on that. Dr. Seven, Portman would tell you I make slow progress, but I go back to her office every 2 weeks and I answer her questions honestly, and I'm trying to learn how to sit with what happened without letting it harden into bitterness. Nathan will inherit what Helen decided he should have. Not more. I kept that commitment because she asked me to, and because the children, Lily and Ben, deserve a grandfather who isn't at war with their father. But I don't pretend the relationship is what I once hoped it would be. Some doors, when you see clearly what's on the other side, you close gently and don't open again. The shoebox is in my nightstand now. I moved it from the garage the same week I got back from Sheila's office. I don't open it often, but it's there, and knowing it's there, knowing Helen is there in whatever way a person can still be present, is enough to get me through most mornings.